I have kept Ernwold sealed for 300 years. Not because the world beyond our borders was dangerous to us, we were never the ones in danger, but because every king before me had learned the same lesson, passed down through the bloodline like the weight of the crown itself. The outside world does not know how to leave things alone. It finds something ancient and untouched and it names it, claims it, draws a border around it on a piece of paper, and calls that border ownership. My grandfather's grandfather had sealed the Eastern Pass with iron and old pack law after the last surveyor made it through. That man had gone back to his city and drawn a map. The map had brought soldiers. The soldiers had brought fire. So the law was simple, and it was absolute. No outsider entered Ernwold and remained. I had enforced that law without exception for 31 years of my reign. I had turned back merchants and wanderers, and once, a contingent of 12 armed men who had somehow found the high trail through the Kethward Range. I had sent them back without violence but without softness, and they had gone. The pass closed behind them like a wound healing, and Ernwold had gone on being what it had always been, vast and green, and unmarked on every map in the outside world. A blank space where the cartographers simply wrote unmeasured territory and moved on. I was in the Eastern Longhouse reviewing the Autumn Patrol records when my senior border captain, a gray-shouldered wolf named Brecht, came to the door and stood there with an expression I had not seen on him in years. "There is a woman, my king." I set down the patrol record. A woman. In the Eastern Pass. She came through the Kethward Gap alone on foot. He paused. She is carrying maps. I thought about that for a moment. The Kethward Gap was not on any outside map. It was not on any inside map either, because we did not draw maps of things we did not want found. The gap was narrow and treacherous and ran through a face of rock that looked, from the outside, like an unbroken cliff wall. The only way to know it was there was to have spent time studying the way water ran down the mountain face in late autumn, reading the drainage patterns the way you would read a sentence. "She found the gap herself," I said. "She had a fragment of old parchment," Brecht said. "Something very old. We do not know where she got it, but she matched the water line on the parchment to the mountain face and walked straight to the gap without hesitation." He paused again. "My king. She is sitting by a fire she built herself. She appears to be eating dried bread and correcting something in one of her notebooks." I stood. I told Brecht I would come and assess the situation myself. I did not tell him I would come as the king. I left my crown in the longhouse and took a plain scout's cloak from the wall peg by the door. I do not know what I was expecting. Something calculating, perhaps. A woman sent by someone with resources and an agenda, or a professional surveyor with equipment, and a company of others waiting at the pass's foot. What I found when I came around the last bend of the Eastern Trail was none of that. She was small. Not fragile, small the way a well-made thing is small, with a kind of economy to her, everything necessary and nothing wasted. She sat cross-legged beside a fire she had laid with care, the stones set in a circle the way people who have spent real time outdoors set them, not the haphazard arrangement of someone who camps as a novelty. Her coat was heavy canvas, worn at the elbows, and she had a leather satchel open beside her that was stuffed with rolled papers and notebooks with cloth covers. She was writing in one of the notebooks with a piece of charcoal, and she was frowning at what she had written with the focused displeasure of someone who knows the answer is wrong and has not yet worked out why. She did not hear me approach, or if she did not startle. She simply looked up when I was 10 feet away, took me in with a calm, measuring glance and said, "Good evening. I'm sorry to be in your territory without introduction. Is there someone I should speak to?" My wolf went still inside me in a way I had not felt in my lifetime. Not still the way he went still before a fight. This was different. This was the stillness of a thing that has been moving for a very long time and has suddenly found the place where it was always going. I said carefully, "I can take you to whoever is in authority." For now, what is your name and what has brought you through the pass?" She looked at me with eyes the color of dark pine bark, direct and steady. "My name is Myra. I'm a cartographer. I have been mapping the Kethward Range for 3 years, and I found a fragment of old parchment in an archive in the Valley City that showed a passage through the eastern face. Everyone I showed it to said it wasn't real." She paused. "I thought they were wrong. And if they had been right, then I would have been standing in front of a cliff face feeling foolish," she said, without apparent embarrassment. "That has happened before. It is not so bad." She looked back down at her notebook. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I don't know who owns this territory or what the rules are about being here. I would very much like to make a proper map of it with whoever's permission is required. And if permission is not possible, I will go back the way I came." I stood there and looked at her. The fire was small and well tended. The dried bread beside her satchel was the kind of food you brought when you expected to be moving for a long time and could not count on what you'd find. She had come through the Kethward Gap alone, in autumn, with no support and no weapons, because she had found an old piece of parchment and believed it against all advice. And now, she was sitting in the most sealed territory in the northern range, eating dried bread and correcting her notes. I said, "I will take you to the longhouse for tonight. It's cold here." She looked up again. Something in her face shifted, not relief exactly, more like recognition, the look of someone accustomed to being sent away who has heard instead a different word. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's kind." She began to pack her satchel with practiced efficiency, and as she reached across to roll the last notebook shut, her left wrist came into the light of the fire. The mark was there. I've worn our pack seal my whole life, the crescentan claw, the mark of Ernwold's binding, the oldest sign in our bloodline's memory. It lives on the back of my right wrist as it has lived on every king of this pack since the seal was first cast. It is not tattooed. It is not burned in. It is simply there, the way the grain is in old wood, as though it grew with the skin rather than being placed upon it. I had never seen it on anyone outside the bloodline. I had never seen it on anyone outside Ernwold. Myra had it on her left wrist, smaller than mine, the lines finer but unmistakable, the crescent curving exactly as ours curved, the claw mark at its base, 3 lines precisely as ours were 3. She noticed me looking and pulled her sleeve down slightly, not with embarrassment but with the automatic gesture of someone used to people asking about it. "I was born with it," she said, matter-of-factly. "Doctors couldn't explain it. I stopped trying to explain it years ago." She buckled the satchel closed. "Shall we go?" I said nothing. I led her down the trail toward the longhouse, and I kept my face neutral and my breathing even, because I was the king of Ernwold and I had been keeping this territory sealed for 31 years, and something in my chest had just cracked open like ice in early spring, and I did not yet know what to do with what was underneath. The longhouse was warm and lit by the long iron chandelier that ran the length of the hall, 40 candles casting amber over the timber walls and the faces of my council. Elder Voss was already there. She always seemed to know when something was happening before I told her, which I had long since stopped finding surprising. My pack captains Rain and Dalk stood by the far wall, and 3 of the senior wolves had arranged themselves near the door with the careful casualness of wolves who were absolutely paying attention. I brought Myra in and gave her the chair nearest the fire. She sat without ceremony, set her satchel on the floor beside her, and looked around the hall with the same quiet, measuring attention she had turned on me at the pass. She did not gape. She did not perform wonder. She simply looked, the timbers, the chandelier, the faces, the great wolf Kern who came and settled 2 feet from her chair without being asked, and without being commanded, which was a thing Kern had not done with a stranger in 11 years of his life. She glanced down at Kern. Then she said quietly to the wolf, "Hello." And she did not reach out to touch him. She waited, her hand resting loose and open on her knee, in the way someone waits who has spent time around animals and knows that the choosing belongs to the animal. Kern leaned forward and put his great head against her knee and closed his eyes. My counsel did not say anything for a moment. Then Dalk said, "She cannot stay, my king." "I know the law," I said, "as well as you do." "Then," I said, "I know it. I did not say we were done talking." Dalk closed his mouth. I sat in the high-backed chair at the head of the table, and I looked at Myra, who was resting one hand very gently on top of Kern's head now that he had made the choice, and was watching the fire with the patient stillness of someone who has learned to wait. "Would you show Elder Voss your left wrist?" I said. She looked at me, then at Voss. She pushed her sleeve back without asking why. Voss crossed the hall, and she was very old and she walked with a cane, but her eyes when she looked at the mark on Myra's wrist were as sharp as a new blade. She stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she said, in a voice I had not heard from her in years, soft and a little wondering, "The prophecy." Rain said, "Voss." "The prophecy," she said again, turning to look at me. "You know it as well as I do, my king. The maid of Arnwold's king will come from beyond the sealed pass, wearing the kingdom's own mark on her skin. You have known it since your father first spoke it to you." She looked back at Myra. "She is wearing the kingdom's mark on her skin." The hall was very quiet. The fire crackled. Kern did not move. Myra was looking between Voss and me with the expression of someone who is following a conversation in a language they don't fully speak, catching the shape of the meaning without all the words. She said, carefully, "I don't know what the prophecy says, but I've had this mark my whole life and I've never known what it meant." She paused. "If you know what it means, I would like to very much hear it." "It is late," I said. "You can sleep here tonight. Tomorrow we will talk further." She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't press. She simply accepted what I offered, thanked me again in that same quiet way, and when Rain showed her to the side room where guests slept, she went without asking for more. I stayed in the hall for a long time after. The council filtered out. Voss was the last to go. She stopped at the door and looked at me. She has known me since I was a child, Voss, and she has never bothered to be careful about what she says to me, and she said, "She was kind to Kern. Kern does not choose strangers." "I know." "And the mark?" "I know," I said. Voss nodded once and left. I went to the cabinet at the end of the hall and took out the pack's iron seal. I held it in my hands. It is old, older than the longhouse, older than the timber, cast in iron and silver in the 1st century of Arnwold's existence, a crescentan claw pressed into a disc that fits in both palms. Every king of Arnwold had held it for their binding. It sat in my hands now, and the candlelight moved over it, and I thought about the woman asleep in the side room with a satchel of maps, and a mark on her wrist that matched this disc line for line. I had not been prepared for it. I did not know how to tell you, even now, what it was like to look at Kern putting his head on her knee or to watch her not ask for more than she'd been given. I did not know how to tell you what had happened inside me when I first reached for her lantern at the pass. I had not told that part yet, and I need to now, because it matters. When I reached out for her lantern to angle it toward her map, my hand had come close to hers, and the mark on her wrist had done something I had never seen a mark do in 31 years of watching for the signs the elders spoke of. It had lit. Not flared, not blazed, lit, quietly, the way a lamp lights when you bring a flame to the wick, steady and certain. And the mark on my own wrist had answered. I had pulled my hand back before she saw. But I had felt it, the warmth, the correspondence, the sense of something clicking into a place that had been waiting empty. I set the iron seal back in the cabinet. I went to bed. I did not sleep. Before dawn, Voss came to my door. She sat across from me at the small table in my chamber without preamble, the way old women who have earned the right to directness sometimes do. She set her hands flat on the table. She said, "You know what must be done. The council will call for her removal." "Yes." Dalk will invoke the law. He will, and he will be right to invoke it. The law is the law, and you are the one who has held it hardest. She looked at me. But you know what the law was made for. It was made to keep Ironwold from being mapped and taken. It was made to keep outsiders who would claim this territory from having any ground to stand on. She paused. It was not made for her. She is a cartographer, I said. She came to map. She came because a piece of old parchment called her, Voss said quietly. Because the gap in the eastern pass was put there in the first age of this pack's life as a door, not a wall. Because the mark on her wrist was placed there before she was born by something older than either of us. She did not come to take Ironwold. She looked at me with those sharp, careful eyes. She came because she was called. I was quiet for a long time. The sky outside the small window was beginning to lighten, the dark pulling back from the ridge like a tide. I said, call the full council, all the elders, all the captains, before mid-morning. Voss stood leaning on her cane. At the door she paused. What will you bring to the hall? The seal, I said, and the truth. She nodded. She went. I dressed in my own clothes, not the plain scout's cloak, not the border guard's gray, but the deep wool and the chain at the collar that every king of Ironwold wore when they stood before the full council. I did not put on the crown. I would not need the crown for this. When I came to the hall, it was full. Every elder had come, every pack captain. The senior wolves stood along the walls, Kern among them, sitting upright and watching the door with his amber eyes. Word had moved through the pack the way word moves, quietly and all at once, and though I had not summoned the pack, some 30 wolves were ranged in the outer hall beyond the doors, waiting. Myra was sitting where I had left her the night before, in the chair nearest the fire. She was wearing the same coat. Her satchel was by her feet. She had a notebook open on her knee and had been writing in it, but she closed it when the hall filled and set it aside and sat with her hands in her lap and waited, with the particular composed patience I had been watching in her since the pass. She saw me come in. She saw the wool and the chain and the difference in how I held myself, and I watched her understand it, a small, steady shift in her face, a recalibration, the look of someone who has been handed a new piece of information and is quietly updating the map. She said nothing. She did not look betrayed or frightened or angry. She looked thoughtful. Dalk spoke first, as I had known he would. He stood and he invoked the law fully, in the formal language, the law of sealed borders, the law of 3 centuries, the command against any outsider remaining in Ironwold past the grace of a night's shelter. He was not cruel about it. Dalk was never cruel. He was simply a man who believed in the law he had spent his life upholding, and he believed in it honestly. He finished, he looked at me. My king, the law is clear. The law is clear, I said. I went to the cabinet and took out the iron seal. I carried it back to the center of the hall. I looked at Myra. Would you come here? I said. She stood. She crossed the hall toward me without hurrying, with that unhurried, unperforming quality that I was beginning to understand was simply how she moved through the world. She stopped a pace away. Your left wrist, I said. She pushed back her sleeve. The mark was there in the morning light coming through the high hall windows, the crescent-tan claw, fine and clear against her skin. I held the iron seal face down, and I set it against her wrist. The hall held its breath. The seal burned gold. Not hot, not painfully, and she did not flinch, but it burned, a warm, deep gold light that came up between the iron and her skin and lit the whole face of the seal from beneath, and the crescent-tan claw that was engraved in the iron matched the crescent-tan claw on her skin mark for mark, line for line, the way a key matches the lock it was made for. The light held for 3 long seconds. Then it faded, and the mark on her wrist was the same as before, and the seal in my hands was the same as before, but the hall was different. The alpha wolves along the walls had risen and moved. They circled Myra, not quickly, not threateningly. They moved the way wolves move when they are acknowledging something old and certain in the way of things. They settled around her in a ring, and they lay down. Kern put his head on her foot. The hall was very quiet. I set the iron seal on the table. I looked at my council, at Dalk, at the captains and the elders. No one spoke. Then Dalk, who was not a man given to gestures, lowered his head. Not in submission, he was not a submissive man, but in the way you acknowledge something larger than the argument you were making. The captains followed. The elders followed. Vyse, who had not sat down the whole time, simply nodded. I turned to Myra. I did not know, until that moment, what I was going to say. I had stood before councils and given commands and navigated 31 years of the work of keeping a kingdom whole, and I had never stood with the particular stillness I felt standing in front of her. She was looking at me. She had one wolf lying across her foot and several more in a ring around her, and she was looking at me with those steady dark eyes, and there was something in her face that was not quite recognition, but was close to it. The look of someone arriving at the answer they didn't know they'd been working toward. I said, "My name is Aldrich. I am the king of Earnwold. I told you I was a scout because I wanted to see you before you saw what I was, and I'm sorry for the deception." She said, "I think I understand why you did it." "The mark on your wrist," I said. "You were born with it. You've never known what it was." "No. It is the pack seal of Earnwold, the same seal that is on this disc, the same seal that I have worn since birth." I showed her the back of my right wrist, the mark there, the same crescentan claw, larger, deeper, older looking, but unmistakably the same. The seal does not appear outside this pack. It has not appeared outside this pack in the 3 centuries we have kept these borders, except on you. I paused. There is a prophecy in this pack that says the mate of Earnwold's king will come from beyond the sealed pass wearing the kingdom's own mark. I have known that prophecy my whole life, and I dismissed it for most of it, because it seemed to me like the kind of thing people say when they want to make a king believe his life will arrange itself conveniently. I looked at her. I was wrong. Myra was quiet for a moment. She looked at the mark on my wrist. She looked at the iron seal on the table. She looked at Kern, who had not moved from her foot. Then she looked back at me. "When you reached for my lantern," she said, "at the pass, did something happen to the mark?" "Yes," I said. "I felt it," she said. "I thought I'd imagined it." "I've been telling myself I imagined it since last night." She paused. "I didn't imagine it." "No." She breathed in slowly. She was not a woman who filled silence with words, and I was grateful for that. She thought, and the hall waited, and I waited. Then she said, "What does it mean? The fated mate, I've heard the term. I know it's something your kind believes in." "It means," I said carefully, "that the bond between us is destined, that it is not something I have chosen or that you have chosen. It was set before either of us was born. It means that you are the one my wolf recognizes as his mate, and that recognition does not waver and does not end." I looked at her directly. "It does not mean you owe me anything. You came here for your own reasons, and you did not ask for any of this, and whatever you decide about what it means, you are free to decide it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "You went to the pass in disguise to see me before I saw the king, and you sat with me by my fire for half an hour and let me talk to you about my maps. Why?" "Because I wanted to know who you were," I said, "before the title got in the way." Something shifted in her face. Not softness. She was not a soft woman, not in that surface sense, but something settled. The way a navigator settles when the landmark they've been looking for comes into view and matches the description exactly. She was quiet for another moment. Then she reached into the satchel at her feet and took out a piece of old parchment, thin, fragile, the edges worn to translucency with age. She set it on the table beside the iron seal. The parchment showed the Kethward range in old ink. The mountain lines faded almost to nothing, and there in the eastern face, the narrow gap drawn in with a single fine line that was barely a suggestion. And at the edge of the gap, in the old ink of whoever had made this chart however many centuries ago, there was a mark, small and worn almost away, but there when you looked, the crescent-tan claw. "I found this in the archive," she said, "in the Valley City." It was in a box of cartography fragments from the first settlement period, and everyone agreed it was too incomplete to be useful and they'd never been able to identify the mark at the corner. She looked at the parchment. I could not stop looking at it. I told my colleagues I was interested in the Kethward drainage patterns. She touched the mark on the parchment with one finger lightly. "I think I knew what it was. I think I've always known what it was. I just didn't have a name for the knowing." I looked at the parchment. The mark at the corner was the pack seal, ancient, faded, but unmistakably ours. "Whoever drew this map," I said, "marked the pass and left the seal." "As a guide," Voss said from where she stood. Her voice was quiet. "For whoever was meant to find it." Myra looked at Voss, then she looked at me. "I thought I was following a map," she said. "It turns out the map was following me." The hall held one more beat of silence, and then it released, not loudly, not with noise or commotion, but in the way a room releases when the thing that needed to be said has finally been said, and the air can settle back into itself. I picked up the iron seal. I held it in both hands for a moment, the way I had held it alone in the hall the night before. Then I set it back in the cabinet. I returned to where Myra stood. "I will not ask you to decide anything today," I said. "The bond is real, and it is permanent in the way these bonds are permanent, but you are a person and not a piece of the prophecy, and I have no interest in treating you like one." I paused. "But I would ask you to stay, not because the law demands it or the seal demands it, because I would like you to stay." She looked at me for a long time. Kern had not moved. The ring of wolves around her had not moved. The light was coming strong through the hall windows now, morning light on the timber and the iron, and she stood in it with her satchel on her shoulder and the old piece of parchment in her hand, and she looked very much like herself, which is to say, like someone who had walked through a gap in a cliff face, because an old map said there was something on the other side, and she had been right enough times before to trust herself. She said, "I would need to send word to the valley. My colleagues will think I've fallen down a ravine." "We can arrange that." "And I would want to make a proper map. A real one, not for anyone outside, for the pack's own records. You should have a proper map of your territory." "Yes," I said. She nodded once. "Then I'll stay." I called the council to attention one last time, in the formal voice, the words that had not been spoken in Ernwold in 3 centuries, not since the last Luna had stood in this hall. Before this council and this pack, I named Myra of the Eastern past the fated mate of Ernwold's king, Luna of this pack, now and from this day. Dalk lowered his head. The captains lowered their heads. The elders lowered their heads. Voss, at the far end of the hall, did not lower hers. She was too old for that, and we both knew it. But she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is now watching it arrive, and she nodded once slowly. The wolves in the outer hall, who had heard everything through the timber walls, broke into the low, harmonious sound a pack makes when something right has happened. Not a howl, something gentler, something that filled the hall and moved through the wood like warmth. Myra stood beside me. She had not taken my hand, not yet. That would come, slowly and in its own time, and I was content to wait. But she was near enough that I could feel the warmth of her. And when Kern finally rose from her feet and pressed his great side against my leg and her leg at once, the way a wolf marks the boundary of what he considers his family, she looked down at him and then up at me with the same quiet, steady expression and said nothing. She did not need to. Later, when the hall had emptied and only the candles and the firelight remained, she spread her best notebook open on the table and began to sketch. Not the map she had come to make, not yet. She was drawing the hall, the timber, the iron chandelier, the high windows, the way the morning light lay across the floor. She drew with a charcoal stick, quick and sure, the lines of someone who had learned to set down what was in front of her before it changed. I watched her work. I had kept this territory sealed for 31 years. I had enforced the law with every bit of the authority I had, and I had believed completely and correctly that it was the right thing to do. I still believed it. Ironwold was still sealed to the world. The Eastern Pass was still iron law. But the prophecy had been laid down before the seal was cast, and the woman drawing my hall by firelight had been marked before she was born, and the old map had been waiting in that archive for centuries, and none of these things had been accidents. There is a kind of order older than king's laws, and it moves more slowly than any army and more certainly than any seal, and it had moved her through the Kethward Gap on foot in autumn with a satchel of maps, and a piece of old parchment, and a mark on her wrist she had carried her whole life without knowing its name. She looked up from the notebook and caught me watching her. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "I'm learning what you look like when you draw." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked back down at the notebook. "You're going to have to tell me a great deal about this territory," she said. "If I'm going to map it properly, it will take time." "We have time," I said. She made a small sound that was almost a smile. Outside, the wolves settled into the long quiet of an Ironwold morning, the great forest pressing its stillness against the timber walls of the hall, the mark on my wrist warm and still, the blank space on her map filled in at last with the name it had always had.